So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Ian Taylor, who's a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Hackney. He's a journalist and he's a member of the NUJ, and I think this is going to be a very exciting meeting. Over to Ian.
All right, how the media lost on June the 8th. I can deal with that question very quickly. Without exception, the media forecast May would win handsomely, and she didn't. I'm sure no one here needs to be convinced that May lost to all intents and purposes. She's back in number 10, yes, but in George Osborne's words, she's a dead woman walking, leading a weak, unstable government engaged in a project which basically runs counter to the majority interests of the British ruling class. Not a good position to be in for the party of the British ruling class. Corbyn got 40% of the vote. I'm not going to dwell in depth on that. Many of you will have been to Charlie Kimber's meeting yesterday, although I will have to repeat some elements of what Charlie said in order to make the points I want to make. The context in which Corbyn got a bit over 40% of the vote is important, isn't it? May was seeking and believed she was going to get a majority of 80 to 100 or more MPs, that she would smash Labour. I was assured by a senior editor on the Daily Telegraph 2 weeks before the election, when Labour was already doing much better in the polls, that the Tories were convinced they would smash Labour for a generation. That was his phrase. Corbyn was not just continually undermined and his leadership questioned in the press and by his own MPs and so on. Less than 12 months before the election, 172 Labour MPs, so the majority of the parliamentary party, had passed a motion of no confidence in him to get rid of him. 4 weeks before the election, it was reported that more than 100 Labour MPs were ready to leave the party immediately after the election and set up a new organisation. That's the context in which Corbyn got 40% plus of the vote. It's of interest to note that on the morning of the election, May was assured that she would have a majority of 92. This was, private polling from the day before. At 8:30 p.m. on the evening of the election, I'm told that privately Labour conceded defeat. An hour and a half later, everybody saw the exit poll. None of the media, the pollsters, the pundits, had a clue what was happening. This was beautifully summed up by Jon Snow, the Channel 4 news presenter, one of the very best broadcasters and journalists in Britain, when he introduced the Channel 4 news on June the 9th. Good evening. I know nothing. The media, the experts, the pundits know nothing. That beautifully summarised the situation. So the media lost. They didn't just lose because they miscalled the result. They lost because they overwhelmingly backed May to win. Even The Guardian, which came out in support of a vote for Labour, it was late in the day and it was half-hearted. So it was a clear blow to newspaper proprietors like Rupert Murdoch. Reportedly, there was an election night party at the Times, and Murdoch stormed out after an hour, apparently, having digested the exit poll. This is the man who, a senior spin doctor in the first Blair government, described as the 24th member of the Labour cabinet, the man who's now seeking government approval for his takeover of Sky. It was a blow to the celebrity news broadcasters and political commentators, you know, the people on six-figure salaries like Laura Koonsberg and so on, who saw none of it coming. It was a blow to the likes of Polly Toynbee, the Labourite Liberal Democrat columnist in the Guardian, and it's worth savouring what Toynbee said when May called the election and Corbyn welcomed the challenge. She said, "Was there ever a more crassly inept politician than Jeremy Corbyn, whose every impulse is to make the wrong call on everything?" The wrong call on everything, that sums up the media and the pundits, really. It was a blow, the election result was a blow to the idea that the left can't win because the media dominates and fills people's heads with rubbish. It's a perfectly understandable idea. If you think back just to 2015, when Labour was led by Ed Miliband, who had been lauded by the right, by the tabloids, for attacking the trade union leaders, influence within the Labour Party, for responding to the Falkirk allegations, if you remember, by changing the Labour leadership election rules, something they probably all regret now, but they applauded it at the time. He was Red Ed when it came to the election, the man who would take Britain back to the bad old days, and so on. It seemed obvious when Michael Foot, a lifetime left-ish winger in the Labour Party, led Labour in the 1983 election and was ridiculed for wearing a duffel coat to the cenotaph and all the rest of it. It was. It seemed absolutely the right idea when you think about the vilification and ridicule Tony Benn serially underwent. Benn, who died in 2014. This was the way the Sunday Times described Benn, the greatest parliamentary socialist of the 20th century in Britain, certainly. The Sunday Times declared Benn as a poisonous irrelevance, charming but poisonous irrelevance. The Guardian described the left he led as deeply conservative, if not actually reactionary. This is in the obituary, when normally people are a bit more charming about someone they didn't like in life. And it suggested the only thing that would have damaged the left in Britain more than Benn's failed attempt to capture the Labour Party would have been his success. This reveals how they really think about Corbyn, of course. That's exactly how they view Corbyn, although they're not spelling that out to quite the same extent at the moment. So, the result nailed that idea, although don't expect it to be the end of it. I could spend the next half an hour just getting cheap laughs from showing you front pages from the weeks leading up to the election. I'll just share a couple with you. Vote May or face disaster. Obviously, we all chose disaster. Very good. Well done. This is one I particularly like. Nice use of Photoshop there on the day of the election. Corbyn. The Daily Mail. Corbyn will tax your work, your garden. That's a worry. Your home, your inheritance. So clearly, people took a lot of notice of all that. A couple of things. I mean, Corbyn was ridiculed. He was Mr. Corbyn. He was the sex pot trot. All that kind of nonsense. He was also associated with terrorism routinely. The Sun ran a headline: Jezza's jihadi comrades. The day after the Manchester bombing, The Sun had a headline inside, I think, "Blood on his hands," picture of Corbyn going on about his previous talks with Sinn Féin and associating him with Sinn Féin and therefore the IRA and so on. This is in the day after the Manchester bombing. The BBC, a 6 o'clock news bulletin by the BBC, George Monbiot pointed this out, at the time of the leadership challenge to Corbyn, was ended with this by the reporter: "This is a fight only one side can win. The others are being carted off to irrelevance," that's Corbyn and his supporters, to a place for political losers. This is the BBC reporting on the election. So that's the sort of coverage Corbyn got. This is in some contrast to the sort of coverage May got. This was how the Tory, her U-turn on the Tory manifesto was greeted. You're probably too small for you to see at the back, but "You won't have to sell your home to pay for your care, so don't worry." May's plan for fairer Britain. This is the Daily Express. So quite a contrast in the way the parties were treated by the media. So the question is, why did the election go the way it did? Now, Charlie dealt with that in detail yesterday. I have to repeat some elements of that in order to make the points I want to make. There's already arguments that have been accepted as wisdom, really, if you like, about why the election went the way it did. If you look at it from the Tory side, if you like, one is that May's hopeless, and her advisors were hopeless while her advisors have gone. And there's some truth in the fact that May's cold and useless and all the rest of it. I had to sit through a speech by a senior political editor of the Daily Mail a couple of weeks ago, and he just made endless jokes about Theresa May. There's more warmth in a freezer full of fish fingers. He told her. He said, when May goes to the dentist, it's the dentist that needs the anaesthetic. So this is the Daily Mail. This is how they see her. It's absolutely true, and I've been told this by several Tory supporting reporters in the national press, that May is despised by her fellow Tories. Indeed, Tim Montgomery, the founder of Conservative Home, who resigned from the Tories because he was unhappy with Cameron's renegotiation of the Brexit agreement and so on, he was forecasting a Tory majority of 60 to 80 that's 3 days before the election. I spoke to him, but he said, regardless of the result, there will be an internal revolution in the Tory party because they can't go on the way they are with working with May. So there's real antagonism towards her within the government, and that's one of the elements of instability. She's also despised in Europe. The leak from after the dinner she had with Juncker, when saying she was bananas, basically, that I'm told by Brussels correspondents that is exactly how May is seen in Europe, and that if she leads the negotiations, it's going to be, for them, it's going to be catastrophic. Okay, that's kind of by the by. A second element of this is that it was a mistake to call an election. Now it was a disaster to call an election. Why did she call an election? She had a majority. And all. This isn't what they said at the time. This is wisdom after the event. The Daily Telegraph greeted May's decision to call the election by saying, a bold decision. It affords Mrs. May the opportunity to become as dominant a figure on the political stage as Margaret Thatcher. So this is, it's bollocks that they saw this as a mistake. The manifesto, the third element of this, the Tories blew it, basically. The manifesto was a disaster. Well, clearly it is a disaster to attack your own supporters by saying you're going to take their home off them when they're retired and need social care. Yes, that was disastrous. But again, It wasn't perceived as a disaster when May released the manifesto. This is the Daily Mail. You know, the Daily Mail, which now says she has more warmth than a freezer full of fish fingers. By any standards, the manifesto is an extraordinary document. Detailed, deadly serious, utterly candid, unashamedly moral. So we can dismiss these explanations of why the Tories didn't do as they expected and Corbyn did so well. Right, then there's arguments from the Labour, from the Labour side, if you like, that accept it was to do with support for Labour. And the widely accepted arguments there are basically it was the young what won it, and it was Brexit. You know, Remainers flooded towards Labour. If you want to read the New Statesman, if you want to, or the Guardian, if you want to get the latest on these arguments, the New Statesman is just an endless hymn to these arguments. I just want to deal with them briefly. Lord Ashcroft, you know, the former Tory party treasurer who sought to torpedo Cameron with the, having a sex with the pig account, now devotes himself to polling and trying to undermine, trying to get back into political life, basically, that way. So he conducted a poll of, or had conducted a poll of 14,000 voters on the day of the election. Only 8% of Labour voters named Brexit as one of the most important issues when casting their vote. The biggest concern for Labour voters was the NHS and then spending cuts. So no evidence whatever of Labour voters being motivated to vote for Corbyn because of Brexit. Yes, the Financial Times analysing polling data, the link between the Remain vote and the Labour surge was negligible. So that's the establishment, the real establishment view, because the Financial Times is kind of the business class talking to itself, not feeding themselves nonsense. Then on the question of age, was it the young voters? Charlie went through the figures, and clearly this is a very important factor and something very important to us. Amongst first-time voters, 18, 19-year-olds, 66% of those who voted Labour. Labour had a 47-point lead over the Tories amongst 18 to 19-year-olds, a 40-point lead amongst 20 to 24-year-olds, a 40-point lead amongst 25 to 29-year-olds, a 26-point lead amongst 30 to 31-year-olds, 5-point lead amongst 44 to 49-year-olds, and thereafter the Tories had a lead over Labour in higher age groups. However, there's something very interesting. The tipping point, the tipping age, if you like, at which people were more likely to vote Tory or Labour at the start of the campaign was 34. On the day of the election, Ashcroft's data shows it was 47. So the average age of more people voting Labour than Tories went up from 34 to 47 in the course of a month. That was the campaign. So it would be more accurate to say there was a surge of middle-aged voters for Labour, which won the election. Clearly, the turnout was up amongst turnout amongst young people. But YouGov, which did a survey of 50,000 UK adults, so this includes those who didn't vote. That's a big survey, 50,000. In the 5 days immediately after the election, more under 25s did not vote than did vote Labour. And this is quoting YouGov's conclusions. Labour was more reliant on voters over the age of 40 than under. More than half, 54% of those who voted for Labour were 40 or over. So I'm not trying to nail the idea that young people were important, because it's very significant, highly significant. But the point is, this was not just the young, this was across the piece, if you like. People enthused by Labour and Labour's manifesto and the promise of Corbyn. Yep. I need a bigger desk next time, whoever's organising Marxism. So the point I want to make is that the only adequate explanation of the election result is class. The fact that Corbyn and Labour's campaign appealed to class, and this is what had the impact. And it's revealed by one question that Ashcroft's pollsters asked those who voted. So they asked, if you work hard, you have to agree or disagree with this statement. It's possible to be very successful in Britain, no matter what your background. 84% of Tory voters agreed. Surprise, surprise. A minority of Labour voters did. When the pollsters asked, in Britain today, people from some backgrounds will never have a real chance to be successful, no matter how hard they work, 2/3 of Labour voters agreed. That tells you what the election result was about. It was about class. So Corbyn appealed to class. The Labour manifesto did. People are aware of the kind of things that were in the Labour manifesto, so I won't go through those. Corbyn was absolutely clear. He described the election as the establishment versus the people. He campaigned, addressing big rallies, all the rest of it. The things people know about. And there was a surge to Labour over the course of the month leading up to the election, off the back of those things. Right, I need to talk for a few moments about the media, otherwise you'll feel you've been cheated and rather than excited. So, how much influence does the media have? Because if you think back to 92 when John Major defeated Neil Kinnock, the Tories defeated Labour, the Sun famously declared on its front page it was the Sun what won it, and that's clearly what the Sun in particular wants you to think. So, quick look at the media. The press is in a crisis with rapidly declining circulation figures. 7 national newspapers lost 10% or more of their circulation last year alone. The Sun's circulation now is about 1.6 million. It's halved since 2008, 2010. It was 4 million when you went back to 1987. The Daily Mail is 1.5 million, down from 2.4 million in 2008. I could go on through. The Daily Mirror's circulation has halved since 2008. The Guardian's has halved since 2010. And so on. And allied to that, their revenue is plunging. The Trinity Mirror, which owns the Mirror and other local papers, its revenue fell print revenue fell 21% in the first 6 months of the year, a full year on year. And digital advertising doesn't come near to making up for it. No, there isn't a publication, either new media or old, that makes money on online. Right. Secondly, the young certainly read newspapers less, if at all. If I think about my partner's 19-year-old daughter, she's never bought a newspaper in her life. Her news consumption is largely online and probably through social media. This is indicated by Ofcom figures. Ofcom's the communications industry regulator in Britain. This is their most recent figures I could find were from 2013. But then only 34% of 16 to 24s looked at a newspaper. This is once a month. 44% got their news online. This will be way out of date. When the circulation figures are plunging at the rate I suggested, this will be way out of date by now. Interestingly, though, only 40% of all adults in Britain look at a newspaper once a month, which tells you that they don't. The print newspapers don't have that bigger or can't have that big an direct influence, if you like. All those who read newspapers and watch TV take what they see and hear less seriously than in the past. This is from the same Ofcom survey in 2013. Only 21% of newspaper readers think the newspapers are impartial. 57% of television viewers, news, we're just talking about news, 57% think TV. If you think the attitudes to what people read online would be different, the figures are even lower than for newspapers. And lowest of all for sites that aren't newspaper websites. So it's not true that people think everything they read online is somehow more truthful than what they can read in the newspapers. And this is across all age groups. So people's perception of broadcast news as being biased is higher amongst over 65s than it is amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, according to Ofcom, the 2013 survey. So this was reflected to an extent in the election, that people disregarded what they were being told by the newspapers they read. So remember that a minority of people are reading newspapers. 30% of Sun readers, the Sun told people if they voted for Jeremy Corbyn, they'd be voting for a Marxist Prime Minister. 30% of them voted for Corbyn. So maybe they did believe what they read in the Sun. I don't. Let's hope so. Daily Mail columnist Stephen Glover was quoted in the Press Gazette, which is the newspaper industry's trade title. Since the election, the press is as biased as ever, but it's much less important. That's undoubtedly true. I'm sorry to agree with a Daily Mail writer, but that is true. Okay. Social media. Was it the case then that it was all down to social media, the young people, but not just young people, using alternative sources of information and so on? Clearly, this is a factor. An Ofcom survey of 2016 found 42% of all adults in Britain access news via social media. And certainly sites like The Canary and Evolve Politics, which support Corbyn, played a role in offering a space for people to put alternative views, to expose the bias of the mainstream media and so on, a platform to challenge traditional media and share that alternative view with a wide audience. And certainly people like the ex-editor of The Guardian, Peter Preston, concluded that this was a major factor. He quoted research by media analytics, marketing analytics firm Enders Analysis, which concluded a common angle among much of the most shared content on social media was criticism of the election campaign coverage of UK newspapers and broadcasters. And Preston concluded millions of young people were going online every day to berate print biases. Undoubtedly, that's true, and that was a factor. I haven't got time to discuss the political economy of social media, the new media giants, and all the rest of it. But one point I have to make is that if people think the availability of this space means the left can now win, look at the United States, where it's Trump that has made that space his own. Social media is very much his terrain, and there's nothing to stop the right doing the same thing here. In fact, the Sunday Times, I think last weekend, reported the Conservatives will go to war with Labour on digital media and create momentum-style social action, social media groups under plans being drawn up by the party. Well, that doesn't mean they can pull it off, but it's a space the right can use as much as the left. Right. key points, I've only got 5 minutes. The media is dominated and controlled by corporate interests. I'm sure everyone in the room's aware of that. 70% of the newspapers in Britain are owned by 3 families. Murdoch's obviously the most obvious, but he's not the only one. They represent the interests of the media owners and their class, of course. They daily regurgitate the values of capitalism, of business, of profits, of competition, of private property, of individualism, of celebrity, and so on. What Marx talked about as the ruling ideas. And they will ridicule, attack, whatever threatens or contradicts those values. Strikes, demonstrations, collective action of any kind, workplace democracy, socialist ideas, socialists, and politicians who support and reflect any of that. But there's a contradiction, because the media must also reflect to an extent what happens in society and something of the reality of readers' lives. So they have to get some element of, low pay, poor housing, powerlessness at work, the consequences of class, if you like, whether it's concern for the NHS or whether it's distorting concern about jobs and pay by directing people's concerns at immigration and so on. It's not true that the media's all powerful. On the contrary, to a large extent, the media tails as well as trying to shape people's ideas. So, in 2008, Rupert Murdoch described Barack Obama as a rock star. I love what he's saying. I'm anxious to meet him. I want to see if he will walk the walk. Well, I bet Murdoch wanted to see if he would walk the walk, or maybe improve the situation for Fox News and the New York Post and so on in the United States. But Murdoch is perfectly happy to support Obama. The reality of the situation was put by a News International executive remarking on the discussions that go on internally ahead of an election, not this one, but previously. The Sun's line or on whether to back Labour or Tories in an election is based on this, quotes, "Call this wrong, then a lot of people will say the Sun is dead as a political force. So what's most important to them is to back the winner." Right, I need to finish. The key thing, and this is what I'll end on. The key thing then to understand what happened in the election and what goes on ultimately within the media against the background of all I've said, it is that what matters is what's happening in society. When people aren't fighting back, when there isn't resistance, the media will behave as it did after the defeat of the miners and so on. When there is a fight, they will attack those who are fighting, as they did during the miners' strike. But when people are doing things in large numbers, what the media say and do becomes an irrelevance. So in 1946, the Labour Attorney General described the media like this: they distort the facts, they suppress the news. A small handful of newspaper proprietors are determined Labour shall not be given a fair run. It's true, it hasn't changed, but Labour won a landslide in 1945 off the back of the desire that there should be no return to the 1930s. And you can go through the history of the relationship between what's happening in society and how the media reflects it. At the high point of the protest and class struggle in the post-war years, in the 60s and 70s, you saw a media that could bring down a president in the United States through exposing the Watergate scandal. You saw a media that the elements of it became entwined in interaction with the anti-war movement in Vietnam. So a journalist like Seymour Hersh would expose the My Lai massacre and so on. And you see the best of journalists at that time, people like formed by that period, people like John Pilger and so on. It's also important to note that the the elections that are where it's pointed to as though the media won the election and defeated the left, it's never the true story. So when Michael Foot led Labour in 1983, he was pilloried, as I described. But what lost Labour the election was the fact the Labour vote was split by Labour right-wingers leaving to form the Social Democrats, who took 25% of the vote and Labour 27%. So basically the Labour vote was split to that extent, and it allowed Thatcher to slip in between. It was nothing to do with Michael Foot or having some left-wing policies in the manifesto. It was people like Polly Toynbee, who was one of the founders of the SDP now part of the Liberal Democrats, in trying to break Labour, and that's what delivered that election. In 1992, when Neil Kinnock lost, and the Sun declared it was the Sun what won it, that was following the defeats of the 1980s, but also the fact that Kinnock had led the development of New Realism with the trade union leaders, which led straight into the creation of new Labour. He didn't offer any kind of alternative. Tony Benn described Kinnock's speeches as like listening to processed cheese, and it's a perfect description of the situation. So the difference now is that June the 8th has made it obvious to millions that it's not the media what wins it. It's what people do. But that's not the end of the story.
So this is a bit of a half question, half ramble, so please bear with me. I'll try to remain under the time. I'm saying this mostly as a training journalist at the moment. What's the sort of general opinion on the apparent war that old media seems to be wavering upon now external news sources such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, general social media being the big three? There's been several instances of these sort of strange things happening. There have been, instead of course with people on our side of the political chart having a massive disdain towards the right-wing media, there's the Daily Mail being the butt of pretty much everyone's jokes, the Daily Fail, the Daily Malicious. No one's taken them seriously in years. Most people would rather fly into the Sun than read an issue of it. It's absolutely absurd. But we have instances, especially going on in America, which is very, very strange, with CNN being the sort of left-wing news source, the proprietor, as Donald Trump would call it, fake news, sort of going along. The Daily Mail, CNN seem to be waging a very, very strange blackmail war at the moment, which has become quite a mini scandal against a teenager who made a video that Donald Trump retweeted that has led to them actually tracking them down and are threatening to release that person's personal information. Basically forcing them to remain obsequious to them under threats of their personal information being thrown out. It's absolutely absurd. So that's basically my question in regards with the sort of war that the old media is waging upon the new. What's the general opinion of it?
Right. Comrade in the red. I'm going to take comrade in the glasses. If people can keep their hands up while I just write down where you're sitting, that'd be great.
Hello. Just a couple of points. The first one on social media. I mean, for a start, thank you for the great meeting. I didn't disagree with a word of what you said. But on social media, yes, it's true, as you said, that the right can also dominate, and they can use social media for their own ends. But I think where it's still valuable, sorry, I'm struggling to reach. Can I just bring it down a touch? That's it, thank you. Yeah, where I think it's still important is that whereas in the past the left, particularly the radical left, could not instantly access hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions of people through social media. Now we can do that. We can directly confront the arguments of the right immediately and to a mass audience. and I think that's important. The second thing I want to say is more of a question. To what extent do you think it's still important to engage with the mass media, particularly I'm thinking broadcast media, because early in Corbyn's leadership, he seemed to avoid and in fact was often ignoring the media, whereas and there was a period where because of the Labour right, he was, is that 1 minute? 2, okay. Because of the Labour right, the media were able to marginalise the Labour leadership, so they weren't appearing regularly on television, they weren't speaking in their own voice. And then with the election being called, the media rules changed, and all of a sudden you've got the Labour leadership team on the television every single day, speaking in their own voice, yes, to a hostile media, as they always will be, but nevertheless, I think that was a turning point, and I'd like to know what you think in terms of they were able to advance, be on the front foot for once, and put forward a very positive manifesto.
Okay, comrade in the check shirt at the back, do you want to come up for next?
Hi, comrades. I was glad that Ian eventually got on to the economic aspect of the situation, because far too often on the left we restrict our analysis of the media to simply an ideological or a political one, when of course it is in itself a part of big business, and it's important to understand that. TV audiences and press audiences are commodities which are traded by the owners of those people in order to sell, or rather to get to sell to advertisers. And it's our eyes and ears in consuming the media that get sold to those people. That has to be part of the analysis all the time. Why else would the political editor of The Sun on the Saturday after the result of this general election be trashing the Tories' attempts to link with the DUP because of their equality policies? The fucking political editor of The Sun criticising the Tories over that, only 2 days after the election result. I'd like to ask Ian why perhaps YouGov and Survation actually got the result pretty much right prior to that, and what he thinks. And I also think there's a real contradiction in Ian's conclusion. Yes, when there is a fight, the media becomes irrelevant. But we are in a period of more or less the lowest qualitative and quantitative level of class struggle in this country in terms of strikes and so on. I think there has to be another explanation for this result, albeit perhaps Ian was referring to future results. I think there's actually a very strange way in which voters, certainly in Britain, but probably in other parts of the world, rather than typically from our normal attitude towards parliamentary democracy and so on, rather than that becoming, fading away, I actually think that in a world where you have no rights at work, your trade union rights are shackled by every which way of legislation, where voting for a local council is a waste of time because local councils don't have any value, when even in our lives as consumers we have so little rights of redress over people who rip us off on insurance and commercial transactions and so on. I think there's actually a situation where workers, in a very contradictory way, suddenly actually cherish their right to vote much more than we would be expecting them to, and actually want to see some change in their lives, which is not what any of the media want to tell us, or even sometimes we think they might go for. I think we have to have Ian's concluding summation, I'm afraid, just doesn't fit with the current period. Thank you.
Okay, after this, comrade with the white shirt on next, yeah.
Well, I agree with Ian's conclusion, and I don't agree with Nick. I think what Ian laid out very well is that there's a contradiction in the media. That's absolutely built in the very heart of the media. Most media is commercial, but it has to reflect the everyday lived experience of people. Otherwise, the commerce fails. Speaking as a journalist, there are a few other journalists in the room. I think most people go into journalism because they believe in speaking truth to power. That's the thing that attracts them, and they get ground down and beaten down and beaten down. And the state of the media should be a concern for us all. The fact that the number of journalists have been hollowed out and hollowed out, the fact that Google's now talking about creating news writing robots so you remove human beings. Well, what does that mean? Where does the content come from? It comes from marketing, not from journalism. It matters every day that there are not reporters in local council meetings. Boring as hell, but that's where you learn your trade. Or they're not reporters in the courtrooms. Terrible things go on in the courtrooms that are never exposed because they're not reporters. As that gets hollowed out, the more important it becomes that we have our own media, that we have Socialist Worker, that we have other things. And I'll just say that the other thing, the pace of changes. The pace of media has risen and changed very, very dramatically. And online, the debates are happening online, the news is breaking online, and we need to be much, much better at what we do online. And there have been some great steps forward with what the party does, what Socialist Worker does, and I hope we're going to see a lot more.
Okay, after this, comrade, you in the blue shirt there.
I have no disagreement. Dave Merrick from Bristol. I have no disagreement with anything the Speaker has said. I just want to touch upon the fact that the media, obviously the mass media were doing what they always do, but also in part they were reflecting, celebrating, amplifying and gloating over the opinion polls that for 90% of the time were wrong. Why were they wrong? If the mass media had taken the trouble to interrogate the methodologies of some of the opinion polls, they may have hesitated just a little bit, because the most significant error, these methodologies are freely available, was that significant polling organisations were shaving off a significant proportion of people that said they were going to vote Labour on the grounds that they belonged to a particular demographic, a younger one, and that demographic had not historically voted in the same numbers as they said they were going to do when they were polled. What was wrong with that? 2 million people, predominantly from a younger demographic, 2 million, registered from the day the election was called to the closing date of them being entitled to do that. Now, it's prima facie almost insane behaviour when you think about it, isn't it, for 2 million people to register to vote inside a 4 or 5 week period and then not bloody do that. And what my son said to me very clearly, he said, Dave, look, young people are not lazy, apathetic bastards. They always tell this lie. They always give us this kind of concern. If young people have something to vote for, you know what they're going to do? They're going to bloody vote for it, you know. And that's actually what they did. And if they'd have noticed what was going on, which of course they didn't because they had no investment in doing so, you know, they might have come up with a more accurate result in the end. Cheers.
Here we've got comrade in the blue shirt. You had your hand up? Yeah. Do you want to come up and speak? Then I'm going to take comrade there.
Hello. Basically, I just want to say I'm delighted that the media got it so wrong, but I'll give you now my analysis of what's going on here, and particularly as I'm from Dublin, Ireland. We found that we in the SWP and People Before Profit, we had a discussion about, you know, using our phones, our smartphones, our iPhones, and we're involved in campaigns like against the incinerator, which is a very contentious issue in Dublin, and also when we're fighting for Repeal the Aid, which is to give free, safe, legal abortion. We're encouraging people to use the what you call the phone. I put up a 1-minute analysis of why I'm at a protest. Like I noticed during the campaign, people were getting up and saying why I'm at a mass rally to support Jeremy Corbyn, why I'm at a mass rally to support Repeal the Aid. And when we were putting them out on the media, in the social media, Facebook, Twitter, we were getting lots of hits. Like the the old ways, I don't know, the old ways of people report, like people still read the papers, but the younger audience are catching on to the videos that we're putting up, and I don't know, there's been a sea change, like from the early 80s, the Conservative parties in Ireland had, including the Irish Labour Party, had about 90% of the vote. And in the last election last year in Southern Ireland, it fell between 45 and 50%. And the rest were voting for ourselves, Sinn Féin, and another independent group. So things are changing. And I have to ask, the question I'd like to ask Ian is mainstream all but dead? And is the new form, if you like, for the left, social media? Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, after this, comrade, I'm going to go for you in the Corbyn shirt, and then you next, yeah.
To defend Taylorism in an amended form, which is what I think he what he actually said. I don't think it's true that Ian said it's just because people are fighting that the media didn't have the effect it did. I think the key question is the gap between the media's message and the material reality of people's lives. That's the key question. You see, if it were, you have to be fighting to see through the media, well, there wouldn't be much seeing through going on in terms of workplace struggles. There's other struggles that are important. But if you tell 6 million public sector workers everything's going really well, that's, judge the Tories on their record and so on, a lot of hollow laughter will be heard. Because you can fool people for a long time, but if your wages have fallen 14%, which many of them have over the last 8 years, it's nonsense. And you can, for a while these things can have an effect, but in the longer term, people say there's a massive gap between my life and between what I'm being told in the media. It's not at all surprising to me that very large numbers of teachers and education workers voted Labour for the first time in 2017 because they know the reality at school is we've got less money, the staff are going, the kids are suffering. Okay, there's been campaigns, that helps, of course, but even just the reality of it makes a difference in the end. Large numbers of health workers voted Labour for the first time in 2017 for the same sorts of reasons. And I think it's not always about fighting, but it is always about how great the gap is between what the media message is and what the material reality. Just on the question that the Irish comrade raised, I think the Irish comrades have done some very interesting things on social media. I think they're very impressive. And, on Socialist Worker, of which I'm the editor of socialistworker.co.uk and of Socialist Worker, we spend a lot of time on the social media and so on, and sometimes it's incredibly effective. A lot of it is about pace. For example, we were the first left publication to put up the history of the DUP, for example, on Socialist Worker. That had over 300,000 reads in the first 24 hours. That's more than we normally get, I can tell you. Because we were the first people who did it, because we had an expertise, because we had a journalist who could write it, could put it up and so on. It's not just about how many clicks you get. It's probably true you get more if you do a video, but actually I think it's less effective quite often than an article. We do lots of videos, but the most important things are where we have very timely, well-produced, well-argued, sharp responses to political events quickly, or we have a longer analysis which people actually learn from. Not so many people may read it, but not all you can't win the argument why you should join us rather than the Labour Party in 141 characters or a 1-minute video or even in a 300-word thing. It takes more than that, and that's why we still have the paper and why we still write.
And after this speaker, it's you at the front there.
Last year there was report into Hillsborough, and that involved 27 years between the events actually happening and justice for the 96 actually happening. Last month, and The Sun was the thing that told the biggest lies about Hillsborough and Liverpool fans on that day. Now, because we have a democratic media that's online and so forth, people in Grenfell can get media justice within 27 hours, and it doesn't take them 27 years to get it, which is a massive departure from where we were 25, 30 years ago. Now, also, it's a terrible thing as well. The nature of Blair's Labour Party, how it first of all got into bed with the metaphorically with Mr. Bush over Iraq and things like that, and then in a non-metaphorical way, where he got into bed with Murdoch's wife, Wendy Deng, in a situation where he was Blair was actually fucking godfather of Wendy Deng and Rupert Murdoch's child. You know, the fucking spawn of Satan, and Blair was his godfather. And what is that all about? You know what I mean?
Okay, come right here. Then the last speaker I'm going to call will be yourself there with the white shirt on.
Firstly, it's about the Labour manifesto, the Magnificent Manifesto. Has anyone investigated how it was that that manifesto got through the Labour bureaucracy? Because I suspect that there were a lot of people in the Labour Party who thought it was Jeremy Corbyn's suicide note. So they let him go through with it and then use it to crucify him after he inevitably lost miserably in the election. That's quite a quick one. Has there been any comment on that? And the other question is, from Charlie's figures yesterday, I'm amazed to see that the Guardian has a predominantly Labour readership by a very high amount, as much as more than any of the other papers practically. So do you think it's time that the Guardian Trust ought to consider putting out to grass a number of its well-known columnists, one of whom has been mentioned recently, but there are several others, and replace them by people who are more left, more on the ball, and know more about politics? Thank you.
Okay, speaker there.
Yeah. I'd just like to come in on the question of the internet and social media, because it's one of the common explanations that the commentariat reach for. Just briefly on the point about circulation. Yes, print circulation is falling, but certain newspapers have been able to adapt by having a much better online presence than others. The Mirror and the Guardian on the sort of centre left have on the one hand, and the Mail on the other for the right, whereas the Sun doesn't seem to be doing quite so well. But the main thing I wanted to say about social media, it's true that a lot more Labour supporting articles were shared than Tory ones, but it wasn't because, for example, Momentum, for example, it wasn't because they had the most whizzy apps. One thing that I think made a big difference was that Momentum set up a website called My Nearest Marginal, where they used the internet as an organising tool. And on this site, they would print canvassing times for every marginal Labour constituency. Now, I'm an SWP member, and I'm not about to join the Labour Party because I believe that elections only happen once in a while, and it's not where power lies in society for all the reasons that people have given. But I went out canvassing for the Labour Party during the election, had a very positive time in Harrow West and Westminster North. The myth that Jeremy Corbyn was some kind of obstacle on the doorstep was complete and utter nonsense, frankly. So there's that. There's also the question of hegemony. Jeremy Corbyn established that hegemony by having big rallies and then enthusing people to go out canvassing for him. He went on stage at a gig in Liverpool where people started chanting, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," and this has got taken up by millions of people in terms of winning a way of winning hegemony that way. The last thing I'd say, it doesn't just come down to the media or social media. It comes out for reasons to vote. Why did Canterbury turn Labour for the first time in its history? It's because students there wanted to scrap student tuition fees. People wanted to get rid of renationalisation. They saw the manifesto. They saw how wonderful it was. Sick of austerity as the main one of the main reasons why there has been this transformation. It's not just about the media or social media. It's what's happened on the ground and how we organise.
Hey, comrades, thank you for those questions. I'm going to hold it. Can you hear me? Okay, 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll pull things together. Hopefully, just on the Labour manifesto. Nobody asked about who leaked it. Apparently it was John McDonnell's office. So playing the media, why not? And it worked very successfully, because that was the leak of the manifesto, which was portrayed as being a disastrous and an indicator of the incompetence at the heart of Corbyn's leadership. It actually was the start of a major factor in tipping things Corbyn's way. But you're absolutely right in the way the Labour right saw it. This was the BBC reporting on the manifesto. Privately, many Labour MPs believe Jeremy Corbyn will get the manifesto he wants, because they were going to give it, they were going to let it through. But in return, he must take full responsibility if, and of course the implication is when, voters find it less appealing than he does. So that was absolutely their intention, that Corbyn would hang himself, because of course they believe the stuff about it being impossible for the left to win. And this is a key point, really, because in talking about the media, we're not just talking about the media, are we? The interests of capital and the media are intertwined, and that includes the Labour right. They share absolutely the same interests in perpetuating the system, in trying to make it work, in holding people down, and all the rest of it. And they will unite in trying to destroy anyone who stands against that. There was a question about polling. You could have a meeting on polling, but basically pollsters don't reach large numbers of people. Mainly because they used to call people at home, and people don't have landlines, and if they do, they don't answer them, so they get very small, they struggle to get samples of people, and they end up speaking to the same people all the time. Even YouGov, which does very big polls, you volunteer to be on a YouGov poll, not the best way to conduct a poll. So polling generally is somewhat dodgy. Last time, the pollsters were under enormous pressure after 2015 because they got it so wrong. They overestimated the Labour vote because they thought that systematically they weren't reaching young people who were likely to vote Labour. So it turned out that they overestimated the turnout for Labour in 2015, and a bit like kicking the television to change channel, they ended up overestimating the other way. They just ignored any results that showed Labour was going to have high votes and so on. They like sheep. They follow one another, so that no polling company wants to be seen as producing a rogue poll, something that goes against what the other pollsters are saying. And the YouGov poll that was referred to, basically what they did was they stripped out the attempt to compensate for the overcompensation for Labour the last time, and came very near the result. But then they were ridiculed for it. But that was the one major poll that basically sneaked through unadjusted. Somebody asked a question about engaging with the mass media and said Corbyn didn't seek to do so. Well, look, Corbyn does understand something about the media. Clearly, it's a way to reach an audience, but you don't control the way you're presented in reaching that audience. The LSE, some academics at the LSE did a study just of the media coverage of Jeremy Corbyn, just the first two months of his leadership in 2015, and they concluded he was subject to ridicule, scorn, personal attacks, association with terrorism, all the rest of it, but also a distortion of his voice. Words were often frequently distorted, taking out of context. When Labour Party sources are quoted, they're invariably against Corbyn and outweigh those supporting him, and so on. Well, Corbyn understood this, and it's part of the reason that he went out speaking to mass rallies and all the rest of it, so that people saw him unfiltered. This wasn't a meeting on the political economy of the media, and I felt I had to skate over a whole number of things in trying to give an overview. Somebody said something, mentioned Paul, mentioned about some mainstream media moving online more successfully than others. Look, The Guardian's one of the biggest news sites, but it loses money hand over fist. If The Guardian hadn't made £800 million a few years ago from selling a car sales paper, the Guardian would have disappeared. It would have gone. That's why they've got this desperate campaign to make people subscribe and so on. If things don't change at The Guardian's a goner. If it's only kept going now because the trust subsidise it. Papers have different models. The Times makes money online by having subscription. The people who subscribe to the Times website, it's not a lot of money. It's about £7 a month or something. The average income is 6 figures of subscribers to the Times. Well, in terms of the advertising sales department in the Times, that's gold dust. So the Times, but the Times doesn't make any money online either. In fact, the only mainstream media title I'm aware of, no, there's two that make money in Britain is online, is the Financial Times. Because the people who want that information can afford to pay for it. It's not true that new media makes money, with two exceptions. So the Huffington Post, the content is delivered free. Journalists write free for the Huffington Post. It's never made any money, lost money. It was a celebrity vehicle for Ariana Huffington, basically, who's now essentially running Uber since Travis Kalanick resigned. So she's done all right of it. No one makes money online out of news, and news generally is in crisis as a consequence. So somebody asked, is mainstream media dead because of social media? Mainstream media is dying, but generally because of the internet, and it's Google and Facebook that are killing it. Google and Facebook sucked up 60% of global digital advertising last year, excluding China, because the Chinese have got their own sites, and will suck up 80% of it within a couple of years. There's nothing left for anybody else. Interestingly, most of the news that people share on social media has come from mainstream media. It's not been created by Google, Facebook, or anybody else. It's just been taken from sites that no longer make anything for it. And the algorithms that drive, in particular, Facebook, means that the stories that come to the top are the sort of clickbait nonsense that everyone will be familiar with. That it's very difficult to even get off your phone. I'm still struggling with my phone for several months after I got it, how I get rid of this shit. 60% of the news stories covered by TV news are mainstream, are print newspaper stories that TV news has picked up. So mainstream media, although it's the circulation, mainstream print media, although the circulations are essentially dying, and the businesses many of them could be dying, they continue to fuel the most of the news you read one way or another. Somebody talked about 2 quick points. Somebody talked about a war on by mainstream news on the new media. Look, this is a product of what I just talked about. The fact that they gobble up everything, and the mainstream media is struggling. So they're hitting back. Facebook and Google don't even call themselves media companies, and they take no responsibility for what they publish. And the mainstream media companies obviously would like them to take the same kind of responsibilities. You know, that sees them end in court sometimes and all the rest of it, because they want to claw back some of the advertising revenue. So it's a battle at the top amongst the bosses over how they divvy up the profits from what they do. And at the moment, Facebook, Google win hands over fist. There is an argument nonetheless for, you know, the mainstream media is important. If we were in the United States now, in the wrestling match between Trump and the CNN logo that was everywhere on social media in the past days, we'd be on the side of CNN there, because it will be the likes of CNN and the Washington Post, now owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, by the way, which will contribute towards exposing Trump and ultimately helping to separate him, along with his failure to deliver policies, from the audience he cultivates on social media. Their exposure of him, as he fails to create jobs and all the rest of it, will bring him down well before he reaches his final term. So people, I didn't mean by any stretch of the imagination to suggest that social media is not an important factor, but you know, we have to be. It's return of the new boss, same as the old boss, isn't it? The Who song. This is the Observer technology journalist John Norton writing just 2 years ago about Google and Facebook. And you know, we would be happy to write this in Socialist Worker. They exist to create wealth, vast quantities of it, for their founders and shareholders. Their imperative is to grow and achieve dominance in their chosen markets. They are as hostile to trade unions, taxation, regulation as John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie ever were. The only difference is that they employ far fewer people, enjoy higher margins, and are less harassed by governments than their predecessors. There's no saving grace in new media.